They said love made her cruel. They said the Queen of England broke her vows to God, broke the laws of men, and broke the neck of another woman just to keep her lover by her side. It began with a fall, a broken body at the bottom of a staircase, a silent house in Oxfordshire, and a name that would stain a crown forever. Her name was Amy Robsart. Her husband was Robert Dudley. And the woman everyone whispered about, the one they said had ordered it all, was Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen, the untouchable ruler who swore she'd never marry. But behind the walls of her glittering court, behind the painted face and the jeweled ruffs, there was a secret so heavy it bent the throne itself. Elizabeth had loved Robert since they were children. And love, for here, would always taste like blood. The story of Elizabeth and Robert didn't begin with a scandal. It began in a prison made of stone and fear, decades earlier, when England still trembled under her father's shadow. They were just two children in a court filled with knives, disguised as smiles. Elizabeth was 10 motherless, fatherless in every way that mattered, branded a bastard by her own blood. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed when Elizabeth was barely 3, and the ghost of that act followed her like a curse. Robert was 11, the golden son of a rising nobleman, born into a family that believed power could be inherited, like breath. When they met, both already understood what most adults never learned in Tudor England. Survival was an art. They studied Latin together, rode horses, traded arguments about philosophy and pride. They laughed in gardens where the air itself listened for treason. Even as children, they noticed each other, the way his confidence steadied her trembling, the way her wit drew his eyes like a flame draws a moth. But childhood doesn't last long in palaces built on fear. When Henry VIII died, the court shattered into factions, and both of their families fell into the storm. Robert's father was beheaded for treason. Elizabeth was thrown into the Tower by her half-sister, Queen Mary. Two souls, trapped in the same stone cage, separated by walls but bound by terror. No one knows if they saw each other in that place. But imagine it. The girl whose mother had died in that same fortress. The boy who'd watched his father's head rot on London Bridge. Both waiting for footsteps that might mean death. Both learning that love and fear can grow in the same darkness. They survived that tower, but neither ever left it completely. Some prisons stay with you, even when the doors are open. Years later, when Mary died and the crown of England rested on Elizabeth's head, she was 25, unterstead, alone, and already hardened by too much loss. The court demanded she marry Spain. France, Austria, all sent suitors lined in silk and lies, but Elizabeth refused every one of them. She did something no queen before her had dared. She chose no husband, and instead she chose Robert. She appointed him Master of the Horse, a title that meant he would ride beside her every day, sleep near her chambers, whisper in her ear at dawn and twilight. And the court noticed, within weeks, London was drowning in gossip. The Queen and her favourite were inseparable. They hunted together, played cards together, laughed too freely, touched too boldly. Foreign ambassadors wrote letters home describing midnight visits, private embraces, hands that lingered too long. Day and night. One of them wrote, "The Queen goes to his chambers." It was scandal, pure and poisonous. But Elizabeth didn't stop. She'd faced execution once. She would not be ruled by rumour. And Robert, handsome, ambitious, dangerously charming, seemed to believe the same. Together, they defied the world until Amy Robsart's body shattered everything. It happened on the 8th of September, year 1560. Amy was found dead at the foot of a staircase. Her neck broken cleanly. Her servants all sent away to a fair. No witnesses. No cries. No struggle. It could have been an accident. It could have been a suicide. Or it could have been murder. By nightfall, the entire kingdom was whispering that Robert had done it. By morning, Europe was whispering that Elizabeth had. The idea was too delicious to ignore a queen so desperate to marry her lover that she ordered his wife's death. She ordered an inquest. Of course, she had to. 12 men swore under oath that Amy's death was an accident. But it didn't matter. The verdict was meaningless against the weight of rumor. In the eyes of her people, their queen was guilty. The young woman's broken body had become a wound in the nation's conscience. And no words, no trials, could stitch it shut. Elizabeth knew it. And in that moment, she made the most ruthless decision of her life. She would never marry Robert. She would not confirm their guilt by taking him to her bed as husband. She would not give the world the satisfaction of being right. She would wear her loneliness like armor, and she would turn her heartbreak into legend. From that day forward, she would be the Virgin Queen, the woman who chose a crown over love, who traded her heart for history. But behind closed doors, when the courtiers were gone and the fires burned low, she still called him Sweet Robin. And when he looked at her, he still saw the girl from the tower, the one who'd survived everything but herself. That is where our story begins, with a broken neck, a crown heavy with secrets, and a love so doomed it became eternal. Because in the end, what killed Amy Robsart wasn't a fall down the stairs. It was the kind of love that kingdoms aren't built to survive. The tower never forgot her. Its cold breath followed Elizabeth long after she walked free, whispering through her bones when she tried to sleep. She had been only 20, but she had seen the shape of death too clearly, its patience, its precision, the way it waited behind every locked door. The days in the Tower of London were endless and cruel, marked only by the scraping of footsteps in the corridor and the echo of the same question pounding in her mind. Will I die like my mother? Every stone in that place seemed to remember Anne Boleyn's last steps. Every draught of air seemed to carry the metallic ghost of her blood. Elizabeth would run her fingers across the cold wall and imagine her mother's hand in the same place, trembling, praying, alone. Across the courtyard, in another cell that smelled of damp straw and fear, Robert Dudley sat with his back to the wall, his eyes fixed on the tiny window that gave him nothing but a slice of grey sky. He too waited for the sound of keys, the signal that he would be led to the block like his father before him. He had been raised to believe that ambition was the same thing as destiny, and now he was learning the price of that illusion. His father's head had been paraded on London Bridge, a warning to all who rose too high. Robert had watched from the shadows, and something inside him had hardened a promise. Perhaps that if he ever lived through this, he would never be powerless again. They were close enough in the tower to smell each other's despair, to sense when the other was awake, to hear the faintest cough echo across the courtyard like a signal from another ghost. Historians say there's no record of them meeting during those months of confinement, but history forgets what the human heart remembers. Maybe they never spoke. Maybe they just knew that there was someone else behind another wall who understood what it meant to be young and hunted, what it meant to have your life balanced on a knife's edge. That small, for invisible connection was enough to bind them tighter than any chain. When freedom finally came, it came without mercy. The tower released them, but the world outside was no less dangerous. Queen Mary still ruled, her faith as unbending as her hatred for Elizabeth's mother's name. Robert learned to walk carefully, to keep his eyes lowered, to let people underestimate him. Elizabeth learned silence, the kind of silence that keeps you alive when every word could be used to destroy you. In the darkness of those years, they both grew into the kind of people who could never again love without fear. Then came the fire and smoke of change. When Mary died and Elizabeth ascended the throne, London erupted in bells and bonfires. A new dame, they called it, the Protestant Queen, young, clever, radiant as the morning star. But Elizabeth knew better than to believe in dawns. She had lived through too many nights. Her coronation crown was heavy, not with jewels, but with ghosts: the father who had killed her mother, the sister who had wanted her dead, the men who had tried to use her as a pawn and failed. She had survived them all. But survival had a price. It made her cautious, and it made her lonely. The first time she saw Robert again after years of separation, she was no longer the frightened girl from the tower. She was a queen now, dressed in gold and command. Yet when she looked at him across the great hall, something ancient and wordless flickered in her eyes, something that no crown could smother. He bowed low, and for a heartbeat the air between them trembled. She saw the boy who had shared her fear, who had walked the same shadowed halls of death, and she smiled a small, dangerous smile that every courtier remembered and none dared to interpret. She made him master of the horse within days, a decision that startled her council. It was an act that spoke louder than any declaration. The master of the horse controlled the royal stables, the royal hunts, the very rhythm of the Queen's daily life. It meant he would always be near her, riding beside her, helping her dismount, holding the reins as she stepped into her carriage, escorting her on every journey. It meant proximity, and in a court where proximity meant power, it was the boldest form of intimacy she could have allowed. The courtiers whispered, but she did not care. She had spent too many years fearing shadows to tremble before gossip. When Robert entered her chambers without being announced, she did not flinch. When she leaned toward him during council, her fingers brushing the edge of his sleeve, she knew every eye was watching. And still, she did not stop. Power was a stage, and she was learning to perform it in her own language, gesture by gesture, silence by silence. At night, when the torches flickered in the corridors and the palace grew quiet, she would think of the tower again, of the darkness they had shared, of the way survival had carved them into matching shapes, ambitious, scarred, hungry for life. Perhaps that was why she kept him so close, because he was a mirror of the part of herself she could never speak of. He had seen her before the crown, before the mask, before she learned how to hide. In his presence, she could still be the woman who had once wept against cold stone and whispered to ghosts. Robert, for his part, understood the power of being needed. He was careful in public, deferential, always ready with a jest to break the tension of politics. But in private, he was bold. He called her my queen with the kind of devotion that felt both reverent and possessive. He made her laugh. The deep, rare kind of laughter that broke through her practiced composure. It was dangerous laughter, always is. For those who rule, it reminds them they are still human. Yet even in those golden early years of her reign, Elizabeth could feel the shadow growing. Every letter from abroad carried another offer of marriage. Every ambassador brought a portrait of some prince or archduke, eager to claim her hand. And she knew that behind every painted smile lay a threat the moment she married. Her power would no longer be her own. A husband would mean heirs, and heirs meant factions, rivals, conspiracies. Marriage had killed too many queens before her. She would not let it kill her too. Robert never said it aloud, but she saw it in his eyes. He believed she would choose him, that love could outweigh politics, that the girl who once shared his silence in the tower would, at last, make him her king. And for a time, she almost let herself believe it too. But the world had already written another ending for them, one carved into the stone of fate and blood, because even as they danced at court, even as he led her horse through cheering crowds, somewhere far away, in a quiet house filled with loneliness, Amy Robsart was dying. Her body had not yet fallen. Her neck had not yet snapped, but destiny was already leaning over the staircase, whispering her name. And Elizabeth, brilliant, too fierce, lonely. Elizabeth must have felt it in the air. That shift, that slow tightening of the invisible noose. She would later tell her council that queens are not allowed to love, as women do. But in those early years, before the world turned her heart to iron, she still hoped otherwise. She still dreamed that a crown could share its weight, that a hand could reach for hers without turning into a chain. She did not yet know that history was already sharpening its knife. She did not yet know that every glance, every rumor, every shared breath with Robert would one day be recorded as evidence in a trial that never happened but never ended. All she knew was that she had survived the tower once, and perhaps she could survive, love the same way, by pretending it wasn't slowly killing her. And so she smiled when he entered the room. She smiled, even when the whispers grew louder. Because for a queen who had lived her whole life surrounded by executioners, what was one more rumor compared to the miracle of feeling alive? The court was a stage, and Elizabeth had learned how to perform her part with deadly precision. Every glance, every laugh, every pause in her speech was measured like a chess move in a game where one mistake meant ruin. Yet behind the curtains of ceremony and silk, something human still burned. An ember that refused to die even when the crown tried to smother it. That ember was Robert Dudley. He moved through her world like fire through smoke. Graceful, bright, impossible to ignore. Every time he entered the room, the air changed, grew tense, alive, as if the walls themselves remembered something they were not supposed to. He had become her shadow, her comfort to her danger. And though the whispers of their closeness had already begun to rot her reputation, she could not let him go. The year was 1559, her second on the throne, and England still held its breath, waiting to see what kind of queen she would be. The men around her, grey-haired lords who had served her father and feared her mother, believed they could shape her like wax. They told her to marry, to obey tradition, to surrender her heart for the sake of her country. But Elizabeth had already seen what marriage did to women. She had watched her sister Mary turn into a ghost in her own palace, her body swollen with phantom pregnancies while her husband ruled in her place. She had watched her stepmother Catherine Howard die screaming for mercy, her head struck from her shoulders because she was too young, too alive, too careless. Elizabeth knew the truth, that none of her counsellors dared to speak aloud. A queen's wedding ring was just another chain, and love was a weapon that always cut the woman deeper. Still, Robert Linger, he was not just handsome, he was dangerous in the way of men who had nothing left to fear. His father had died a traitor, his fortune destroyed, his family disgraced. Everything he now possessed, his status, his wealth, his redemption came from her. And he never let her forget it. Not with words, but with the quiet certainty in his eyes whenever he knelt before her. He was the only man in her kingdom who treated her not as a symbol, but as a person. He dared to tease her, dared to contradict her, dared to make her laugh in the middle of council meetings where every other man spoke in trembling flattery. It was intoxicating, that sense of being seen, and it was also the beginning of her undoing. The rumours began like a breeze and grew into a storm. Ambassadors sent letters to their kings describing scandalous scenes, the Queen visiting Robert's chamber at night, the two of them walking alone in gardens until dawn, his hand brushing hers too often to be accidental. Elizabeth's advisors begged her to distance herself. to think of appearances, to remember she ruled not as a woman but as England itself. But she would only smile, tilt her head, and change the subject. It was not defiance, it was survival. If she admitted to caring, she would become vulnerable. If she denied it, she would become a liar. So she danced between both truths, balancing like a blade on the edge of power and desire. Robert's wife, Amy Robsart, lived far away in the countryside. Her name was barely spoken at court, and when it was, it came with a tone of pity or disdain. She was the obstacle, the inconvenience, the proof that Robert belonged to another woman, even as the Queen's eyes followed him like the tide follows the moon. He visited Amy rarely, writing to her in the same polite tone one uses for a distant relative. Some said she was ill. Some said she was bitter. Some said she prayed daily for death. None of them knew that her death would soon come true, or how much blood it would spill in silence. Elizabeth did not plan that death, but she felt it before it happened. In those weeks, she grew restless, pacing her chambers at night while the wind clawed at the windows. She spoke to no one about it, not even Robert, though his absence gnawed at her like hunger. And then came the letter short, cautious, carrying the smell of wax and dread. Amy Robsart was dead, her neck broken, found alone at the bottom of a staircase. The servants had been away at a fair, by her own command. It could have been an accident, yes, but in England, where rumour moves faster than light, accidents are never innocent. When the news reached her, Elizabeth froze. She did not scream, did not faint, did not pray. She stood by the window and stared at the grey sky, as if waiting for God himself to appear and explain why every act of love in her life had to end in blood. That night, she did not eat. The next morning, she ordered an inquest, demanded transparency, demanded that justice be seen to be done. 12 men swore that Amy's death was accidental, but the verdict meant nothing. In the eyes of her people, she was guilty of murder, not proven, but believed. The whispers became knives. Ballads were sung in taverns about the queen who killed her rival. The French laughed. The Spanish priests preached sermons, calling her the new Jezebel. Even her own courtiers began to watch her differently, as if wondering what else she might be capable of. And through it all, Robert begged her for forgiveness, for patience, for the chance to explain what could not be explained. He swore he had nothing to do with it, that he was as shocked as anyone. She believed him because she needed to. The alternative that the man she loved had killed for her was too terrible to bear. Yet something broke between them that no apology could mend. They were still inseparable, still bound by the same secret fire. But now there was a shadow between them, a shadow shaped like a dead woman. Elizabeth knew she could never marry him now, not even if she wanted to. To do so would be to confirm every whisper, every accusation, every suspicion that already circled her crown like vultures. So she made a different choice. She chose to become untouchable. From that day forward, she would belong to no man. She began to build the myth that would outlive her, the Virgin Queen. The woman who had married her kingdom, instead of any husband. She turned her solitude into spectacle, her heartbreak into legend. But legends come at a cost, and Elizabeth paid it daily. In the mornings, she stood before her mirror and painted her face with white lead, hiding the exhaustion that carved itself deeper each year. At night, when the court slept, she sat by the fire and read Robert's letters, tracing his handwriting with her fingertips, as if by doing so she could hold back time. The world believed she was heartless, but her heart had only learned to hide. Robert still walked beside her, still smiled when she looked his way, But their love had turned into something quieter, heavier, like two stars that could never collide, yet still burned for each other across the black. He knew she would never be his queen in name, and she knew he would never stop trying to be her king in spirit. They were bound not by what they shared, but by what they could never have, and somewhere deep within her, beneath the layers of duty and silk and powdered calm, Elizabeth began to understand the truth that would define her reign, that power and love are not meant to live in the same house. One always kills the other. She had already chosen which one would survive. The silence that followed Amy Robsart's death was worse than the accusations. It spread through the palace like a sickness, creeping into the walls, the tapestries, the very air she breathed. Elizabeth could feel it every time she entered a room, the sudden hush, the quick glances, the words that stopped just before reaching her ears. No one dared to speak of it openly, but everyone thought it. The Queen had killed for love. It did not matter that the jury had called it an accident, or that there was no proof of poison or plot. In a world built on superstition and fear, truth was a fragile thing, and perception ruled stronger than law. The people had already chosen their story, and in it, she was guilty. She had endured hatred before bastard, heretic, witch, seductress. But this was different. This was betrayal woven into the fabric of her reign, a wound she could not close without bleeding her own name. Dry. She turned to her council for guidance. But even there she found only half-truths and veiled warnings. William Cecil, her most trusted advisor, stood before her one evening and said, in that careful voice of his, that if she married Robert Dudley now, England itself would crumble. Your Majesty, he told her, the people would not see a union, but a confession. And Elizabeth, who had built her whole life on mastering silence, said nothing. Robert withdrew from court for a time, retreating to his estate, leaving behind a storm he could not control. He wrote to her often letters filled with grief and devotion, promises of innocence, words that seemed to tremble, even on the page. She read them all, sometimes in the early hours of morning, when the candlelight made the ink look like blood, and sometimes in the deep stillness of night, when every word felt like a wound. She wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, because if she did not, then everything that bound them together, years of laughter, loyalty, survival would collapse into dust. But belief did not silence the world. Ambassadors whispered to foreign kings that England's queen was ruled by a murderer. The French called her a fallen woman. The Spanish called her a heretic in love with sin. And even her own subjects began to wonder if God had turned his face from their sovereign. Elizabeth stood before her mirror each morning and forced herself to meet her reflection. She painted her face white, not for vanity, but for armor. If she could not cleanse her name, she would turn herself into an icon. Perfect. Untouchable. Divine. The more they gossiped, the closer she kept Robert. He returned to court months later, and though the scandal still clung to him, she welcomed him as though nothing had changed. To the horror of her council, she made him master of the ordnance and granted him new lands, new titles, new favor. It was defiance disguised as mercy. Every act of kindness she showed him was a message to her enemies. She would not be controlled by rumor, nor ruled by fear. But in private, when the halls emptied and the torches burned low, they argued, not as queen and subject, but as two people bound by a grief neither could speak aloud. Sometimes she shouted, her voice shaking the walls, accusing him of carelessness, of weakness, of failing to protect her from the storm that had swallowed them both. Sometimes he shouted back, reminding her that he had lost more than she, his wife. His peace, his good name. They never spoke of Amy directly, but her ghost was always there, standing silently between them. On other nights, when the rage subsided and exhaustion took its place, she would sit beside him and rest her head against his shoulder, and they would say nothing at all. Silence had become their only safe language. Years passed, and the scandal dulled but never died. It lingered like smoke after fire, faint but inescapable. Elizabeth had learned to use it, to turn gossip into myth, to let her contradictions make her fascinating rather than damned. The Virgin Queen. They called her now the woman who ruled alone, who refused every suitor, who claimed to be married only to England. It was a lie, but it was a useful one, a lie that kept her throne steady while her heart burned beneath layers of ceremony. Robert remained her constant companion, though the nature of their closeness shifted. What had once been passion became something sharper, more dangerous, a hunger for power disguised as loyalty, an understanding that love in their world could never be tender. He wanted to be king in all but name, and she knew it. She saw the ambition in his eyes, the same glimmer that had once burned in his father's before it led him to the block. Yet she also saw the child he had been, the boy in the tower, the man who still waited for her to say the words she could never risk speaking. Sometimes she caught herself imagining what it would have been like if Amy had lived, if the scandal had never happened, if she had been free to love him openly. It was a fantasy she allowed only in solitude, one that dissolved the moment she returned to her throne. She knew the truth. If she had married Robert, England would have fallen apart. The nobles would have rebelled. The foreign powers would have mocked her. Her council would have turned against her. And in the end, she would have lost not just her crown, but her life. Power demanded sacrifice, and Elizabeth had chosen long ago which sacrifices she was willing to make. There were days, however, when she envied the ordinary women of her realm, the ones who could love without consequence, who could grieve without an audience. She envied their freedom to feel without calculation, to weep without scandal. For a queen, even sorrow was political. When she cried, she did it behind locked doors, and even then she covered her mouth to silence the sound. Robert understood her loneliness better than anyone. That was his advantage, and his curse. He knew when to comfort her, when to challenge her, when to disappear long enough for her to miss him. He knew how to make her feel seen, and how to remind her of the walls she had built. There were moments, brief and fragile, when they allowed themselves to forget who they were. A laugh shared during a hunt, a glance across a crowded hall, a secret smile when their hands brushed beneath the table. But every moment of joy carried the weight of what it cost them to have it. In the years after Amy's death, Elizabeth's court became a theatre of contradictions. Music, feasts, and laughter filled the palace. Yet beneath it all was the tension of a country watching its queen refuse to be human. They wrote songs about her beauty and her virtue, painted her as a goddess, draped in light. But none of them saw the woman who walked her chambers at night, whispering prayers to no one, haunted not by sin, but by the unbearable gravity of survival. And still, Robert stayed. Through triumphs and tempests, through foreign threats and domestic plots, he stood beside her. Theirs was not a love that healed. It was a wound that refused to close, the kind that becomes part of the body, pulsing quietly beneath the surface. She had once said that a queen must love her people above all else. But deep down she knew that wasn't true. She loved him more than she should have, less than he deserved, and exactly as much as her crown would allow. By the end of that decade, when the world had grown tired of whispering about Amy and started to whisper about other things. Elizabeth realized that she and Robert were no longer fighting the rumors they had become them. Their love, if that's what it still was, existed entirely in the space between fact and legend. They were both prisoners now, not of the tower, but of history itself, bound to each other by the same chain of duty and desire. And though neither would ever say it aloud, they both knew that their story had already ended the moment Amy's neck broke, and everything that followed was just the echo of that fall, carrying through time, soft and endless. The years that followed taught Elizabeth that silence could be more powerful than any proclamation. She no longer tried to defend herself from whispers, no longer flinched when foreign ambassadors wrote home about her indecent affection for Robert Dudley. Let them talk, she thought. Words were wind, and she had survived worse storms than gossip. But inside, something was changing. The woman who once laughed freely at banquets and rode her horse through the fields of Greenwich with her hair flying like a banner had grown colder, more deliberate, more measured in every motion. Power had begun to harden her heart the way frost hardens the ground. It glittered, but nothing grew there anymore. Only Robert seemed able to thaw her, though even that warmth now came at a cost. Robert had learned to navigate her moods the way sailors learn to read a tempest. He knew when to retreat and when to press closer, when to flatter and when to challenge. He was clever, perhaps too clever, and though she needed him, she began to fear how much of herself she had already given away. He had become her confidant, her companion, her mirror, and that was dangerous. For mirrors do not lie. He knew her weaknesses, her fears, her loneliness. He knew that she woke in the night with her mother's scream echoing in her mind, that she still felt the tower's chill in her bones, that every time she saw a gallows, she imagined her own crown lying beneath it. He knew all this, and yet he stayed. That, more than anything, made her love him, even when she wished she did not. England, however, did not care for the private heart of its queen. The kingdom demanded an heir. Every parliament session brought the same plea: marry, Your Majesty. Marry and secure the future. Every council meeting echoed with the same desperation, the same veiled threats. And each time she refused, she gave the same calm smile, saying she was already bound to her husband, the Kingdom of England. The line became a shield. One, she repeated, until even she began to believe it. But in the quiet of her chamber, she would sit by the window, her face ghostly in the moonlight, and wonder what it would have felt like to hold a child of her own, to look into eyes that carried her father's fire and her mother's courage and her own stubborn will. Then she would remember the price women paid for such dreams, the blood, the agony, to the risk of death, and she would turn away from the thought as from a flame too bright to look at. Robert never stopped hoping. He believed that time might soften her, that love might one day conquer the armor she wore. Sometimes he would take her hand during their long rides and speak of what could have been their own home, their own children, a life away from court. She would listen, dear Herr Expression, unreadable, and then pull her hand away. You know why I cannot, she would say softly, and he would answer, I know, but I cannot stop wanting it. That was the tragedy of them both, knew the limits of their love, and neither could bear to stop reaching beyond them. As the years deepened, Elizabeth's court turned into a theatre of devotion. Poets wrote sonnets comparing her to goddesses. Courtiers swore undying loyalty. Painters captured her face, surrounded by suns and serpents and flowers, all symbols meant to disguise the woman beneath. She encouraged it. If she could not be a wife or a mother, she would become a myth. Myths did not bleed, did not age. did not fall in love. Myths could not be accused of murder. She built her legend stone by stone until it stood taller than any man alive. And at its center, like a secret flame, stood Robert. He, too, played his role. He learned to smile in the right places, to bow when the council watched, to hide the frustration that burned through him each time she used his devotion as proof of her purity. For that was the cruel irony. His love became her weapon. The world believed she had remained untouched. Untouched by sin. Untouched by man. Untouched even by grief. And she let them believe it because it made her powerful. But Robert knew better. He knew the trembling in her hands when anger took her. The way her voice broke when she was afraid. The way she could go from fire to ice, in the span of a breath. He had seen the woman beneath the crown, and sometimes he hated her for keeping him prisoner there. Still, he stayed. Through war and plague, through endless negotiations and foreign threats, he stood beside her like a shadow that would not fade. When she made him Earl of Leicester, the court gasped at the intimacy of the gesture. During the ceremony, she placed the robes upon his shoulders herself, her fingers brushing his neck. Lingering a moment too long, the French ambassador later wrote that she had tickled him playfully before the entire court, and that the air in the hall had been thick with scandal. Elizabeth did not care. She wanted the world to know that she could love and still rule, that she could desire and still command respect. But that defiance was a dangerous game, and she knew it. Every gesture toward Robert was an act of rebellion against the cage her own image had become. There were nights when she would send for him long after the candles had burned down. He would come quietly, his boots echoing on the marble floors, and she would ask him to sit beside her. They would talk not of policy or war, but of the past, of their childhood, of the tower, of their lost innocence. She would ask him if he remembered the way the sky looked through the narrow window of his cell, and he would smile and say yes, though he knew she was really asking if he still loved her the same way. They never touched beyond what was permitted, but the air between them was charged, alive, as if the memory of every moment they had not dared to live pressed against them, demanding to be acknowledged. When he left her chambers, the corridors always felt colder. The guards would bow as he passed, their faces unreadable, and he would walk through the palace gardens until dawn, his breath clouding in the chill air, knowing that what they shared could never be spoken of, not even to each other. Sometimes he wondered if she truly loved him, or if she only loved the idea of him, the safe rebellion, the forbidden dream that allowed her to feel human without surrendering her throne. And sometimes, in her loneliest moments, she wondered the same of him. Time moved forward, and with it, the distance between them grew invisible, but vast. They had built something between them that was too strong to break and too fragile to live. It was no longer love in the way ordinary people understand it. It was a pact with destiny, sealed in silence and sacrifice. They were each other's weakness and strength, mirror and wound. Outside the palace, England changed. The people began to see their queen as divine, a being beyond desire, a woman chosen by God himself. Elizabeth let them. It was easier to be worshipped than to be pitied. But every time she looked at Robert, she saw not divinity, but the truth. She could never say aloud that beneath the crown and the myth and the armor of history, she was still a woman who had once loved a man, and that love had killed something in her that no crown could ever restore. And as the years rolled on, the legend of the Virgin Queen grew brighter, while the woman behind it grew lonelier, until even she began to wonder whether she had invented the myth, or whether the myth had swallowed her whole. There came a time when even Elizabeth began to fear her own reflection. The years had passed quietly but without mercy, and though she still ruled with unmatched strength, she could feel the weight of time pressing against her shoulders like invisible chains. Her hair, once red as autumn fire, had begun to thin beneath the gold of her crown. Her face, painted each morning into perfection, was no longer a canvas of youth, but a mask of endurance. She told herself that power was eternal, that love was the weakness of those who came before her. But sometimes, when the candles burned low and the music of the court faded into the dark, she would see in the mirror not a queen, but a woman who had traded every beating pulse of her heart for the silence of history. Robert Dudley was no longer the reckless man he once had been. The fire in him had dimmed, replaced by something heavier, steadier, a loyalty that bordered on exhaustion. He still came to court when summoned, still rode beside her in hunts, still smiled, that same half-smile that once made her forget who she was. But the years had carved deep lines around his eyes, and the grief of all he had lost lingered in every movement. They had both survived their scandal, but survival is not the same as living. It was as if they had been turned to stone by the gaze of time itself, locked forever in a pose of devotion that neither could escape. Elizabeth began to see ghosts where there were none. Amy's name had not been spoken in years, but sometimes, in her dreams, she would see a staircase glistening in the dark, a body at the bottom, and a crown rolling down the steps like a fallen coin. She would wake drenched in sweat, her hand clutching the sheets, whispering words she did not remember by morning. She could not tell whether she was haunted by guilt or by the memory of love itself. Perhaps they were the same thing. The world outside her chambers had not stopped spinning. There were threats everywhere: Spain with its mighty fleets, Scotland with its restless queen, whispers of rebellion in Ireland, and plots in the shadows of her own court. Elizabeth fought them all with her mind as her weapon, her voice as her sword. She charmed, she deceived, she commanded, and she conquered. Yet even in the midst of war and politics, her thoughts would return to Robert. It was as if he existed in her like a second heartbeat, one she could neither silence nor admit to hearing. One evening, after a long day of council, she found herself alone with him in the gallery at Whitehall. The tapestries glowed in the light of the fire, and for once, there were no courtiers watching, no scribes waiting to record her words. He looked at her not as a queen, but as the woman he had always known, and she felt something in her chest ache with a familiarity she had tried for decades to bury. "You have everything," he said softly. "Everything but peace." She did not answer. Peace was a language she had forgotten. She turned instead to the window and watched the river glimmer under the moonlight. "You think I could ever rest?" she asked, her voice breaking with fatigue. "Even God himself cannot rest while his name is used for power." He smiled sadly and said, "Then you and God are not so different." That night she could not sleep. The echo of his voice followed her through the corridors of her dreams, mingling with the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs of England, the sound of distant cannons that had not yet fired. She knew a storm was coming. Spain was preparing its armada, and England would soon face the greatest threat of her reign. Yet part of her, some small, selfish part, was relieved. War meant distraction. War meant movement. Anything was better than stillness. For in stillness, she was forced to feel, and feeling was far more dangerous than battle. When the Spanish Armada came, Elizabeth rode to Tilbury to meet her troops. She wore a breastplate of shining steel over a gown of white satin, her red hair unbound beneath a simple crown. The soldiers knelt before her, thousands of men hardened by fear and hunger, and she raised her hand for silence. Her voice carried across the field like a flame in the wind. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she said, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king. And a king of England, too." The roar that followed was like thunder. In that moment, she was not just a ruler. She was England itself. Its defiance. Its pride. Its fury. Robert was there, watching her from horseback. And he knew, perhaps more than anyone else, what it had cost her to become that vision of glory. He knew how many nights she had cried in secret, how many mornings she had woken to the sound of her own loneliness. He watched her raise her sword and felt both love and sorrow, for he understood that she no longer belonged to him or to herself. She belonged entirely to the crown. When the Armada fell, and England stood victorious, the people called her divine, but the victory that crowned her also aged her beyond her years. The joy of triumph quickly curdled into weariness, and the Golden Queen began to fade into legend, even while she still lived. Robert grew ill soon after. His letters to her became shorter, his handwriting trembling across the page. He asked her once to visit him at his estate in Oxfordshire, but she refused. Queens did not visit dying men. That was for wives, and she had denied herself that name long ago. When word came of his death in 1588, something inside her went still. She was sitting at her desk when the letter arrived, sealed in black wax. She read it once, then again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into a different truth if she stared hard enough. He had died quietly, they said, without pain, surrounded by servants who prayed over him. His last message to her had been a few lines written in a trembling hand. "My most dear and sovereign mistress, I do humbly kiss your feet, praying to God for your long health and reign." She read it aloud once, her voice barely a whisper, and then folded it carefully, pressing it to her lips. For the rest of her life, she kept that letter locked in a small wooden box beside her bed. On its lid, she wrote with her own hand, "His last letter." In the days after his death, she would not eat, would not speak. Her ladies found her sitting motionless by the window, staring into nothing, her crown untouched on the table beside her. When they tried to comfort her, she waved them away. "He is gone," she said simply, "and with him goes the part of me that was still alive." The words frightened them, for they had never seen her so still, so human. The years that followed turned her grief into habit. She became colder, sharper, less forgiving. Her court continued its music and masquerades, but the laughter never reached her eyes. She was the Virgin Queen still, the great monarch of a golden age. But within her, there was only quiet, the kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from the end of all feeling. She had conquered nations, defied kings, outlived every rival. But in the privacy of her chamber, when she opened that small wooden box and touched the faded ink of Robert's last words, she knew that history would remember her as a goddess, and yet she herself had never felt further from heaven. After Robert's death, something in Elizabeth's world turned to glass. Everything looked the same. From the outside, the court still glittered with jewels and laughter. The ambassadors still bowed low. The music still drifted through the corridors of Whitehall, but beneath it all, there was a stillness, too perfect, too fragile, the kind that comes before shattering. She no longer trusted her own emotions. Grief, to her, was an indulgence she had long forbidden herself. But this grief was different. It did not burn, it froze. It moved through her slowly, as if determined to claim her one memory at a time, until every thought of Robert felt like an ache she had simply learned to live with. She told her ladies that queens could not mourn, but in the dark, she would touch the small wooden box on her bedside table, tracing the words she had written on its lid. His last letter. until her fingers went numb. The world outside her mourning refused to stop. England was now the heart of a vast power, her navy triumphant, her merchants sailing to new worlds, her people singing her praises as the Virgin Queen who had led them into a golden age. Statues were carved in her image, plays written to glorify her wisdom, and every painter competed to capture her face, the ageless, untouchable woman who ruled with a mind sharper than any sword. Yet the truth, hidden behind layers of paint and ceremony, was that Elizabeth had grown tired. Power, once intoxicating, had become a burden too heavy to hold without trembling. She had no heir, no husband, no child to call her own. And though she told herself that England was her family, there were nights when she felt surrounded, not by subjects, but by ghosts. It was around this time that a new figure began to rise at court, a young man named Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex. He was Robert Dudley's stepson, bold, reckless, beautiful in the way of men who have never known fear. He reminded her of the youth she had buried long ago, and for that reason alone, she could not look away. He flattered her, teased her, argued with her as no one else dared to. He made her laugh again, and that laughter frightened her more than silence ever had. She told herself that he was just a boy, her late love's kin, a reflection of memory, nothing more. But the heart is not easily reasoned with, and the more she tried to keep him at a distance, the closer he came. The court, of course, saw everything. They whispered that the aging queen had found a new favourite, that her vanity had blinded her, that she had fallen into the same trap her mother once did, mistaking desire for destiny. Elizabeth pretended not to hear. She had long since mastered the art of wearing indifference like armour, but deep inside, she felt the familiar trembling of danger. Essex was ambitious, hungry for power, too much like the younger Robert, only less wise, less patient. He wanted to be adored, not understood. And Elizabeth, who had spent a lifetime navigating men's ambitions, I saw what he was long before he saw it himself. Yet still, she kept him near. Perhaps she could not bear the emptiness his absence would leave. Their relationship was a storm that never rested. He infuriated her, challenged her in council, defied her orders, yet she could not bring herself to banish him. He called her my sweet mistress, and she would scold him for insolence. But the words lingered in her mind long after he left the room. He would ride off to war without her permission, return to court uninvited, throw himself at her feet in repentance, and she would forgive him every time, until the day came when forgiveness was no longer possible. As the years slipped past, Essex's pride grew beyond her reach. He believed himself indispensable, the rightful heir to her favour, and perhaps even her throne. When his military failures humiliated him before the kingdom, he turned his frustration into rebellion. In 1599, he led an armed uprising against the very woman who had made him everything he was. Elizabeth, weary as she was, met his treason with the same cold clarity that had guided her all her life. She ordered his arrest, signed his death warrant, and watched the world that once worshipped her fall silent again. When Essex was executed, Elizabeth did not weep. She did not speak of it at all. But those who served her closest said that she aged 10 years in a single season. She withdrew from public life, refused to see her courtiers, refused even to be dressed in the bright colours that had once been her symbol of power. She wore black and gold, now mourning and majesty intertwined. Her ladies found her pacing the halls at night, murmuring to herself, as if rehearsing conversations with ghosts. Sometimes she would stop by the window and stare into the darkness, whispering a single name, not Essex's, but Robert's. There were moments when she wondered whether she had cursed herself. She had refused marriage to preserve her freedom. But that freedom had become a cage made of duty and memory. Every man she had ever loved, her father, her suitors, her friends, her favourites, had either betrayed her or died. Even her faith seemed to have dimmed. The prayers that once steadied her now echoed back unanswered. She began to understand that her title of Virgin Queen was not a crown of purity but of solitude. She had given her heart to England, and England, though faithful in its loyalty, could never love her back. The years of glory were over. The music that had once filled her court had quieted into a kind of ceremonial echo, and the laughter of youth had long faded from her halls. Her hands, once graceful and sure, trembled now when she held a quill. Her eyes grew dim, and she spent long hours in silence, surrounded by memories she could neither banish nor forgive. Her courtier still knelt. Her subjects still cheered, but she could feel the distance widening between herself and the world she had built. In the last years of her reign, she kept Robert Dudley's letter closer than ever. It was more than paper and ink. It was the last piece of her that still felt alive. Sometimes she would open it just to touch the handwriting, to see his words as though they could bridge the gulf of time and death. "Your long health and reign," he had written, and she wondered if he had known, even then, how lonely that reign would become. When her ministers came to her in those final winters, begging her to name a successor, she brushed them aside. What did it matter now? Who followed her? She had given everything: her youth, her love, her peace to the crown. Let it decide for itself. She told them, almost absently, that they would know her heir when she was gone. And they believed her, because they had to. No one dared admit that the great Elizabeth had become a shadow of herself. By then, she no longer wore the jewels she once adored. The mirrors were covered in her chambers. Her favourite musicians no longer played. The fire burned low, and her once commanding voice had softened into something fragile, uncertain. Her ladies whispered that she seemed to be waiting for something or someone, and perhaps she was. For when she sat in her great chair by the window, eyes distant and glassy, her lips sometimes moved without sound, as if answering a voice only she could hear. Robert's voice, perhaps the echo of the man who had once loved her, not as a queen but as a woman, and whose absence had hollowed her heart so completely that even the glory of empire could not fill it again. In that silence, in that long twilight between greatness and oblivion, Elizabeth began to understand the cruel symmetry of her life, that she had been born to love what she could never keep, and to keep only what she could never love. Winter settled over England like a shroud, and the once luminous court of Elizabeth Tudor dimmed with it. The great queen, the woman who had defied popes and kings and storms, no longer woke to the sound of trumpets or the eager footsteps of courtiers. She slept little, ate less, and spoke rarely. The world around her seemed to shrink. The vast halls of Whitehall, once alive with laughter and intrigue, now echoed with the soft, uneven rhythm of her footsteps as she wandered aimlessly through corridors lined with portraits of her past. They stared down at her, her father with his cruel, triumphant eyes, her mother forever frozen in youth, her younger self painted in gold and light, radiant and invincible. She would stop before them sometimes, her breath visible in the cold air, and whisper as if to the dead, asking whether they had all been worth it. She had outlived nearly everyone who had ever loved her. Her cousins, her ladies, her advisors, one by one, they had gone, taking with them the fragments of her humanity. Only memory remained, sharp and unkind, her mind still clear as polished glass. but her body betrayed her with every dawn. She could no longer stand through an audience without trembling, no longer ride the horses she had once ruled with grace. Yet she refused to take to her bed. A queen must die, as she has lived, she told her attendants. Upright, and so she stood hour after hour, day after day by the window that overlooked the gardens where she and Robert Dudley had once walked together. The trees were bare now, the ground hard with frost. But sometimes, if the wind was kind, she could almost hear the echo of his laughter in the rustling leaves. Her ladies begged her to rest, to eat, to pray, but she waved them away with the same distant smile she had used all her life to keep the world at arm's length. You cannot pray for what is already decided, she murmured once. God and I, we have been at odds too long. It was not blasphemy, only weariness. She had spent her entire life bargaining with heaven, pleading for safety, for victory, for time, and now, with time running out, she had nothing left to offer. There was a strange peace in that surrender. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she would ask for her candle to be brought closer and read Robert's last letter again. The paper was soft and yellowed now, its ink faded but still legible, his handwriting trembling with the illness that had taken him. My most dear and sovereign mistress. The words felt alive beneath her fingertips, like the faint warmth of a hand she had once held. She knew them by heart, could recite them without looking, but she needed to see them, the curve of each letter, the places where the ink had blotted, the mark of a life that had once been entwined with hers. When she closed her eyes, she could still remember his voice, the way it wrapped around her name, the way it made her forget, for a moment, that she was England. Her court had grown afraid of her silence. There were rumours among her servants that the Queen had begun to see things, that she spoke to shadows, that she smiled at no one, that she would not sleep for fear of her dreams. It was true. The dreams had changed. No longer visions of triumph or betrayal, but softer, quieter things. Sometimes she saw herself walking through a sunlit field, her hair loose, her crown gone. Sometimes Robert walked beside her, his face as she remembered it, before grief had hollowed it. They did not speak. They did not need to. The dream always ended the same way, with the two of them standing at the edge of a river, its water dark and endless. She would reach for his hand, but before she could touch him, she would wake, her pillow wet with tears she had not realized she shed. As her health declined, the council pressed her harder to name her successor. She resisted with the stubbornness that had once made her unstoppable. To choose meant to let go. To name another monarch was to admit that her reign was ending, that the sun that had shone on England for nearly half a century was at last descending into twilight. They will know when I am gone, she told them, her voice steady but distant. They always do. Her final public appearance was brief and subdued. She stood before Parliament, wrapped in layers of velvet and lace to conceal the frailty beneath, and thanked her people for their faith. The voice that once commanded armies and inspired poets trembled now, but it still carried the weight of a lifetime. Though you have had, and may have, many princes more mighty and wise, she said, you shall never have one who loves you more. There was no applause when she finished, only silence broken by the sound of muffled sobs. They all knew it was farewell. When she returned to her chamber that night, she refused to undress. This body has worn a crown too long to be seen in weakness, she whispered. For days she would not lie down, would not eat, would not allow the bed to be prepared. She sat in her chair, motionless, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. When her ladies asked what troubled her, she said only, I see many faces, all waiting. Some thought she meant the ghosts of her enemies, others her people. But one of her oldest attendants later confessed that she believed the Queen was speaking of Robert. On the fourth night, as the candles burned low and the chamber grew colder, she finally allowed herself to be helped to her bed. The linen smelled of lavender and age. Her breathing was shallow, her hands cold. The courtiers waited outside, praying quietly, but she had long since ceased to hear them. Her mind had gone back through time to the laughter of her youth, to the sunlight on her mother's hair, to the warmth of a man's hand in hers. For the first time in many years, she smiled, faintly, as if recognizing a familiar presence. Those who were there said she whispered something just before the end, but none could agree on what it was. Some claimed she spoke Robert's name. Others swore she said, "I am tired." A few believed she said nothing at all, that her final breath was not a word, but a sigh of release. When dawn came, she was gone. The sun rose over London, glinting off the river, touching the towers of Whitehall with gold. The Queen's body lay still, her face serene, her hand resting over the little wooden box beside her. Inside was the letter that had outlived them both. England mourned for months. Bells tolled in every church. Poets wept in every tavern. And sailors lowered their flags as if the sea itself had lost its queen. But in that vast silence, beyond the reach of rumour and crown and time, there remained the simple truth that no one could take from her, that beneath the legend, beneath the power, beneath the centuries of glory, she had loved once, completely, and that love had shaped the fate of an empire. When the news of her death spread across England, it moved like a slow tide through the streets, quiet at first and then swelling into a sorrow that seemed to swallow the entire realm. The people had always called her Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the mother of her nation. But when the bells tolled from London to the farthest villages, they did not ring for a goddess. They rang for a woman whose presence had been the rhythm of their lives. The merchants closed their shops. The churches, filled with incense and mourning, and sailors in distant harbours, wept without quite knowing why. It felt as if the sun itself had gone out. For 44 years, England had known no other sovereign, no other voice that could steady a storm or silence a rebellion. And now that voice had fallen silent forever. Yet behind the pageantry of grief, behind the mourning banners and the solemn processions, there was something deeply human in the way the people spoke her name. They did not talk of her wars or her policies. They whispered of her eyes, her laughter, her pride, her temper, the small pieces of her that had made her more than a monarch. She had become their mirror, and in losing her, they felt the loss of something within themselves. Her body lay in state at Whitehall for many days, surrounded by candles that burned without rest, the wax pooling like tears around their bases. Her coffin was draped in purple velvet, embroidered with gold, her crown placed upon the pillow above her head. The courtiers who came to kneel beside her did so in silence, their faces pale in the flickering light. Some wept openly, others bowed only briefly before leaving, unable to look too long at the stillness that once had commanded their every movement. A few whispered that even in death, she appeared unyielding, as if daring time itself to touch her. They said her expression was peaceful, but in the lines of her mouth lingered the faintest trace of defiance. The same defiance that had carried her through decades of love and loss and solitude. Robert Cecil, her last great advisor, oversaw every detail of the funeral. He had served her faithfully, and though she had often scolded him, he now moved through the arrangements with a tenderness he had never shown while she lived. It was he who ordered that the letter from Robert Dudley be placed beside her, in the little wooden box she had kept at her bedside until her final breath. He had seen her open it countless times, her fingers tracing the faded ink as if it were a living pulse. He understood, better than anyone, that this letter was her last confession, her truest testament. It was not a document of state or faith or duty. It was the story of her heart, and it would follow her into eternity. When the coffin was finally carried out of Whitehall, the streets were lined with thousands. Men removed their hats, women bowed their heads, and children held their mothers' hands in silence. The procession moved slowly, almost reverently, through the grey London morning. Horses draped in black pulled the carriage. Behind it came nobles, priests, and soldiers, their armour muted by mourning cloth. The air smelled of rain and smoke and sorrow. Somewhere in the crowd, an old man murmured that he had been a boy when she first took the throne, that he had seen her ride past in her youth, radiant and fierce, and now he had lived long enough to see her return to dust. Others crossed themselves and said they had never seen England without her and could not imagine what such a world would be. At Westminster Abbey, the organ began to play, deep and slow. The choir's voices rose like a wave breaking against stone, and the sound filled every corner of the ancient church. Her coffin was placed in the vault beneath the floor, beside her half-sister, Mary. The irony was not lost on anyone. The two queens who had once stood divided by faith and fire, now resting side by side in eternal silence. The inscription above them would later read, "Partners in throne and grave. Here we sleep. Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of the resurrection." It was a lie of mercy, perhaps, but also a reminder that time has a way of softening even the sharpest divisions. As the final words of the burial service were spoken, a beam of sunlight broke through the high windows of the abbey, falling directly across the flag-draped coffin. The people gasped, and the priests paused in wonder. Some said it was a sign, a blessing from heaven for the woman who had defied so many men and yet never lost her faith in England. Others whispered that it was the soul of the Queen herself, rising at last into the light. In truth, it was only the morning sun, but for those few moments, every heart in the abbey believed it was something more. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to leave, a quiet rain began to fall outside, soft and steady. The drops struck the cobblestones like the ticking of an invisible clock. History had already begun to move again, indifferent and unstoppable. A new king waited across the border in Scotland, James of the House of Stuart, heir distant cousin, the man she had refused to name, but whom all now accepted as her heir. The courtiers who had served Elizabeth would soon serve him. The banners of mourning would give way to those of coronation, and the empire she had built would continue to grow, carried forward by the force of her legacy. Yet for many, her absence was not something that could be replaced. The idea of her was too vast, too deeply rooted. She had not merely ruled England, she had become it, and in that way, she never truly died. Her face remained on every coin, her words in every law, her image in every dream of power and sovereignty that England ever dared to have. Poets still wrote of her long after her coffin was sealed. Sailors whispered her name when the sea turned rough. Even her enemies spoke of her with a kind of reluctant reverence. She had lived long enough to outlast hatred itself. But beyond the grandeur, beyond the centuries of admiration that would follow, there lingered something more intimate, almost tender. The people who had known her, not the Queen, but the woman, remembered small, human things. The way she reached for her dog's fur when she was anxious, the way she could laugh suddenly, unexpectedly, like a girl, the way her eyes softened when she spoke of her mother. And for those few who had seen her in private moments, they remembered the box she never let out of her sight, the one that held a single letter written by a man long dead. In the years that followed, scholars and historians would write endless pages about Elizabeth's reign, her politics, her victories, her vision, but none could quite explain the mystery that clung to her even in death. She was both flame and ice, saint and sinner, ruler and woman. She had loved without surrender and ruled without mercy, and somehow the two had never fully destroyed each other. In the end, she was exactly what she had always claimed to be, not a wife, not a mother, but something larger and lonelier. She was England itself, and England, like her, would never again be the same. And somewhere, perhaps beyond the reach of time, the Queen who had refused every man's hand now walked once more beside the one she could never have. In the hush beyond history, there was no crown, no court, no need for silence. Only two figures meeting in the sunlight after centuries apart. Her head turned toward him in recognition, his hand outstretched in welcome. No more guilt, no more longing, only the peace that had eluded her for a lifetime, a peace earned through love, that even death had not been able to erase. Centuries passed, and yet her story refused to fade. The stones of Westminster still whispered her name when the wind moved through the cloisters, and the river she once gazed upon still carried the reflection of her reign like a long, unbroken memory. The world had changed, the palaces rebuilt, the thrones inherited, the crowns reshaped, but Elizabeth remained. Not in flesh, not in bone, but in spirit. She had become something larger than life, something that did not end with her death. History, in its relentless hunger, tried to define her scholars, measured her policies. Kings envied her endurance. Poets turned her sorrow into song, but none of them could capture the strange, fragile pulse that still beat beneath her legend. For she was not simply a ruler, not only a woman of power, but a soul caught between love and duty, haunted by the things she could never allow herself to feel. Even now, 400 years after the candle beside her coffin burned out, she lived in the imagination of those who tried to understand her. Children in classrooms repeated her words without knowing the weight they carried. Actors painted their faces white and golden to play her on stages where she never stood. Painters imagined her smile, half human, half divine, her eyes filled with a kind of ancient loneliness. The myth of Elizabeth grew with every retelling, her solitude polished into virtue, her pain rewritten as strength. But beneath all the embellishment, beneath the crown and the armor and the legend of the Virgin Queen, there still lingered a woman who had once walked the same earth, breathed the same air, and felt her heart break under the same impossible choices that define all mortal lives. Sometimes, when night falls over London and the mist drifts low over the Thames, there are those who swear they have seen her standing at the window of Whitehall, a pale shape against the moonlight, her hand resting on the sill, as if still waiting for someone who never came. They say her face is calm, but her eyes are full of longing, that she turns her head toward the river, as though listening for the echo of a horse's hooves, for the laughter of a man whose ghost never left her side. Perhaps it is imagination, or perhaps love, once bound to a life so powerful, cannot simply vanish. Perhaps it lingers, finding form in shadow and memory, the way music lingers after the last note has faded. The England she built had long since become something she could not have imagined. The ships she sent across the seas had grown into empires, their sails replaced by iron and smoke. The church she defended had fractured and reformed 1,000 times. The poets she inspired had written of kings and tragedies far beyond her era, yet her presence remained at the heart of it all. Woven into the very language and rhythm of the island she once ruled, Every crown worn after hers carried a trace of her defiance. Every queen who followed bore the shadow of her legend. Even the modern world, stripped of its rituals and thrones, seemed to remember her, though most did not know why. For Elizabeth's reign was not merely the story of a monarch, it was the story of humanity at its most fragile and most determined. She had shown that a woman could wield power in a world built to deny her, that strength could exist in silence, that love could survive even when it was forbidden. She had turned her loneliness into art, her loss into empire. She had shown that greatness is not born from perfection, but from endurance. Every time she chose the crown over her heart, she reforged the meaning of what it meant to rule, not as a woman, not as a man, but as a soul forged in fire. And in doing so, she had paid the highest price imaginable. She had outlived her own happiness. There are stories that say, in her final hours, when her breath had slowed and the room had grown dim, she smiled, not the cold, painted smile of the queen, but the soft, unguarded one of the young girl who had once dreamed of freedom. Perhaps, in that last instant, she had seen him again, her sweet Robin, waiting just beyond the veil of the world, his hand outstretched, his eyes bright as they had been when they first met among the danger and laughter of their youth. Perhaps he said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and perhaps she followed, stepping from shadow into sunlight at last. In the centuries that followed, the poets would give her back her youth, the historians her power, but only the dreamers would give her peace. They imagined her not as a ghost, but as something more tender, a woman walking through a golden field. The weight of her crown finally gone, the sound of her people's laughter carried on the wind, the sky above her endless, the light eternal, and beside her, the man who had waited through time itself for her to return. In that imagined eternity, there were no courts, nor betrayals, nor masks, only two souls bound not by duty, but by the simple truth of recognition. And yet, even as time softened her into myth, the lessons she left behind remained sharp and alive. Power, she had shown, is never free. It demands not just sacrifice, but the surrender of one's most human parts. To lead is to stand alone, and to love in such solitude is to risk turning your heart into stone. But she had done it. She had lived and ruled and suffered without breaking. Her courage became a light by which generations learned to navigate their own darkness. In that sense, Elizabeth did not merely survive her age, she defined it. The fire she carried burned long after her body turned to dust. When historians write of her now, they use words like legacy and glory, empire and reform. But none of those capture the sound of her heartbeat when she first realized she could never have the man she loved, nor the silence that filled her chambers when she was left with nothing but memory. They do not describe the weight of the crown pressing against her temples, or the quiet joy of a smile shared in secret, or the way her hands trembled as she signed the death warrant of the man she could not save. Those details belong not to history, but to eternity, the hidden space between fact and feeling where all true stories live. If you listen closely, you can still hear her, not in speeches or records, but in the rustle of the Thames at night, in the tolling of the Abbey bells, in the faint shimmer of dawn over London's rooftops. Her voice lingers there, quiet but unbroken, whispering that every choice has a cost, and that even the most powerful hearts can be undone by love. She whispers of the courage to stand alone, of the sorrow that comes with greatness, of the beauty that exists in restraint, and somewhere beyond that whisper, beyond the reach of time and legend, Elizabeth Tudor Queen, daughter, lover, Survivor walks at last without her crown, her heart light, her steps unburdened, her story finally complete. In the end, she was not merely England's monarch. She was its soul brilliant, tragic, fierce, and free. And though her throne has long been empty, her echo remains, eternal as the sea that once bore her ships, and endless as the love she never stopped carrying within her.